Right, I've just started the YouTube simulcast. Yeah, we've got quite a lot of people registered for this one today, and we can only get 100 people in on a Zoom webinar at one time. So we made sure this is available on YouTube simultaneously. Also gets a... Oh God, and now I can hear myself back again in the stereo. That's better. Yes, so as I was saying, you know, it's good to have another way of people getting access to it, because lots of people don't have access to Zoom, but hopefully they can get access to YouTube as well. It's on about a 30-second delay. They can't always ask questions though, sadly, because I'm not sure that I can monitor everything all at the same time. Okay, just another couple of minutes.
Richard, if there's any questions, are you going to read them out for us? I don't think I'll be able to see them. Yes.
I'm going to do that. That's my job. So I'll explain how it works with everybody that's on the once we get going. So about 50 people in at the moment, I think, something like that. And I can see that Susie is starting to join us. Okay, we've hit 2 o'clock and I'm keen to make sure that we start and finish this one on time. I can see that there are still attendees flooding in. We've still got quite a few to make it in. So I'll just outline how it's going to work first of all. I have 3 different screens on the go at the same time. So if you see me moving around, don't worry about that too much. Just need to remember to press all the right buttons at the right time and mute and unmute appropriately. So I've got some PowerPoint slides here that we're going to use to help guide this, but I will flip back to the all participants viewing screen at times as well, so that you can see everybody that's involved. So what we will do on this one is we will use the Q&A section to ask questions. Now, I'm sure we're all getting really good at using Zoom now, so there is an option in there called Q&A. Please type any questions that you have as we go along. There are 4 different sections on this, so I think when we start each section, I would invite you all to put in your questions there, and then I'll read out as many as I can within the time for the attendees on there. I've also got a little bit of pre-prepared content that we've worked on together, actually, to illustrate some of the key points that we want to talk about. It's been recorded and will be available to review on our website shortly, along with all of the other webinars that we've been running over the last 12 weeks, I think it is now. So we've done quite a few of these, and we've got another 10 to come this month, and more on that one later on. I'll make sure that these PDF slides are also available as well, because they do have a little bit of information in there too. So I think I'll start introducing this. So I'll go through to the attendees in a second. Just wanted to mention that we've covered lots of similar topics to this in previous webinars. We talked about leadership, safe system, about how you analyze risk on roads and carry out route analysis, something very relevant to rural roads. Managing speed and compliance is one that Tanya and I have done too. And then one that Dan did last week with a whole host of guests as well was about urban roads. So this week I'm leading this session, which is looking specifically at rural road risk. And I've got some friends, at least I hope they're friends, to come and join me on this one. So can I ask you, Susie, to say who you are and what your organisation's interest is in rural roads? Unmute is coming soon.
Hi.
No.
Sorry about that. New to being a panelist, I think. So hi, I'm Susie Charman. I'm the Executive Director of the Road Safety Foundation. We're a charity working in Great Britain, and every year you might know us for publishing the annual Eurorap risk mapping results, which covers mostly rural roads. We're also working with lots of road authorities, including Highways England, and lots of local authorities as well, assessing risk on roads using the IRAP method, which is a proactive safety inspection method. And the majority of those roads are also rural. So we tend to have a bit of hands-on experience in terms of risk, and also some policy experience as well, in terms of looking at methodologies and the way that we relate to safe systems in this country and so on.
Okay, thank you, Susie. Neil.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Neil Gregg. I'm Director of Policy and Research for IEM RoadSmart. In case anyone doesn't know, that was formerly known as the Institute of Advanced Motorists. Clearly, I'm sort of here to talk about the sort of driver behaviour, training aspects of rural roads. We obviously believe that our advanced motorcycle and driving tests will help people to cope with rural roads as best they can. Unfortunately, of course, due to lockdown, we're not currently doing anything in terms of on-road training, although we are hoping to start up our motorcycle training on the 15th of June next week. So that's quite good. And we've done some research in the past on rural roads issues, particularly looking at contributory factors in rural roads, and also just at the general sort of patterns of accidents that take place on rural roads. So we've been interested in rural roads in terms of research as well as policy for many years.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Teresa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Teresa Chiano. I'm the Partnership Manager for GoSafe in Wales. This is the Wales Road Casualty Reduction Partnership. Some of the other hats that I wear is I'm also Chair of Road Safety Wales and on Board of Trustees for the Parliamentary Advisory for Council for Transport Safety. Our interest primarily, obviously, we've got a beautiful country with lots of rural roads and the challenges around enforcement there, and in particular motorcycle collisions in our more rural areas as well.
Thank you. And then finally, Tanya.
No, so I'm Tanya Fosdick, Head of Research at Agilysys, with working with Richard. Been involved in all sorts of different research projects which relate to rural roads, but specifically looking at residency and how those from particular areas and particular backgrounds are overrepresented in different types of collisions, particularly on rural roads.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So let's get on to it then. So here's the first section. And we're just going to talk generally about rural roads. Who's at risk? Are the roads the problem? What kind of dangers do motorists face? And what interventions can be successful? So in order to paint the picture, first of all, I have this incredibly colourful tree diagram that I very swiftly created before the start of this, which is comparing who tends to be killed or seriously injured on Great Britain's roads. So on the left-hand panel, we've got urban roads, and on the right-hand panel, we've got rural roads. So on the left-hand side, you can see that pedestrians make up the majority of KSI casualties, whereas they're fourth on the list for rural roads. You look at the second highest group is in urban roads is cars, but they're far and away the majority on rural roads. So these are, you know, what was the person injured in at the time. So motorbikes are pretty much the same numbers on both urban and rural roads, which might be a surprise to some people because there's a very large association with rural roads and motorbikes. But then looking at cycles, so pedal cycles much higher within urban areas, but then, you know, they're not an insignificant number in there within rural roads. In fact, higher than pedestrians actually, which may be a surprise to some, I'm not sure. Goods vehicles don't tend to be represented very highly in either, or they're much more highly represented in rural roads. Obviously there aren't as many of those on the road, and you know, these are just raw figures. They don't take into account vehicle flows, and then we've got some other motorists in there at the end, but that's giving you an idea of how the KSI casualties lie in there. So I mean, split in the UK more or less 50-50 between urban and rural, but then there's the differentiation there. So going back to the questions, I mean, I wonder if anybody on the panel has a particular thought about who they think is more at risk.
Richard, I'm terribly sorry, but we couldn't see the display properly on your last slide. All we had was a background with some headings. Sorry.
Oh dear. Well, okay, it was close to being able to see it. I talked through most of the numbers okay, so hopefully you managed to get an understanding of what was going on there. But yes, showing that it's pedestrians in urban areas, but in rural roads it really is cars and those in cars that are most at risk. Okay, would anybody else like to elaborate with words, more words and experience?
Can I kind of start with thinking about residency? Is this a good place to think about the fact that
Certainly.
Car drivers are obviously not one homogenous group here, and actually the research that we've done looking at who's involved on particular rural roads, that those at kind of either end of their driving career are kind of particularly vulnerable. So you've got obviously your inexperienced young drivers who are at risk, as well as kind of your elderly, older drivers. And certainly some of the research that we looked at was that postcode, looking at rural residency, meant that, you know, it showed that both particularly young drivers were up to 44% more likely to be involved in an injury collision than their urban counterparts. We got licensure data, and actually they get their licenses earlier, and it seems to be that it's the fact that they have to drive. And so on a cold, wet December morning, both the young driver and the older driver don't have choice. They don't have other options about, you know, how they can use transport. They have to take their car to college, to the doctors, etc. And so I think it was, instead of just thinking about the roads themselves, the communities and what alternatives they have if they're being forced to drive when perhaps they're not well equipped to do so.
Okay, so I talked about types of vehicles that people might be driving. Has anybody got any comments on the types of road users from their experience? Maybe you, Neil?
I think Tanya sort of hit it on the head, really. It does seem to be an issue of inexperienced younger drivers, perhaps older drivers more these days as well. I don't think there's such a thing as a killer road. I think we've come away from that sort of description of the killer road, but there's certainly unforgiving roads. And also, I think if you do look at some of the data, people in rural areas are sometimes driving older vehicles, and of course, they're less likely to protect them in the event of a crash. So you have an unforgiving roadside, an older vehicle, inexperience, and that combination of things together means that you have that higher fatality rate for car drivers. But certainly, there's no doubt that it is a car driving issue. But I think that also you have to bear in mind that the dependence on cars in rural areas is much higher as well. And that's going to be something we might come on to later on as well. But certainly with public transport causing all these issues, car driving, and I think also it highlights the fact that nobody is actually well prepared for rural road driving. And that's something we could maybe talk about as well, because ultimately rural roads do not form part of the current driving test. So there is no current real pressure on people to necessarily learn properly how to cope with a rural road. And that's something that does need to be addressed.
In terms of risks that the roads might cause, and road problems, Susie, what are the biggest problems you think in terms of collision types that cause the most severe collisions, injuries?
Sorry, I am joined by another participant at short notice. If anybody hears any noises in the background, but we'll try and keep it as professional as we can, considering. So in terms of the risks, there are really four main crash types that we see. There are head-on crashes, which can be particularly severe on single carriageway rural roads. And certainly in terms of survivability, we know that as soon as you get above about 44, 45 miles per hour, your chances of being killed in a head-on crash really rocket through the roof. So ideally, if we're talking about rural roads and safe systems, we might be thinking about keeping speeds down below about 45. Sorry. So you've got head-on crashes, you've got run-off road crashes, and that's where driver inexperience really plays a huge role, actually, taking a bend too fast, and so on, typical patterns of younger driver crashes, single vehicle run-off crashes on rural roads. There's plenty of roadside obstacles to crash into, as we know. Any tree, any pole, any sort of hard structure. And then you've got junction crashes. And as we also know, on single carriageway roads, you have a lot of at-grade T-junctions, crossroads. It's unavoidable, isn't it? But actually, if you have a side impact above about 30 or 40 miles per hour, again, risk rockets through the roof in terms of your likelihood of being killed or seriously injured. And then, of course, we've got our fourth main crash type, which is crashes involving vulnerable road users, so cyclists and pedestrians. And certainly, I'm really interested at the moment in active mobility, and particularly with COVID-19 pandemic and all of our Boris walks and our cycle trips that we've been undertaking. The rural road environment has changed a bit, hasn't it? And in a good way, because we're allowing more people to get active, but equally that brings a bit of risk. So we don't really have great facilities for cycling and walking on our rural roads, as we know. So those are our four main crash types: head-on, run-off, junction, and those involving vulnerable road users.
Thank you, Susie. Teresa, what about the roads in Wales and your experience with the partnership? What do you think some of the biggest problems are?
Well, certainly everything that Susie said is reflected in the collision pattern that we have in Wales, and particularly in our rural areas. I mean, it's almost impossible to segregate traffic or road user types. Notwithstanding, as well as cyclists or pedestrians, you probably have got horses or other animals on, possibly on the carriageway. So certainly higher speed is a problem, but I would say really inappropriate speed, and possibly younger drivers and older drivers are represented in our collisions. Is probably a lot around being able to handle the changing road environment as well. But certainly in Wales, in the more rural areas of Dyfed-Powys and North Wales in particular, we do have an issue with motorcycle deaths being severely overrepresented. We've got a large Operation Darwin, around enforcing and educating people. We have lots of people travelling into the country specifically to ride the roads. We've got an education campaign called Wales by Bike, which is designed around encouraging people to enjoy the beautiful countryside, but making sure that they do so in a safe manner and get home safely as well. If you're travelling from West Midlands into Mid Wales and so on, it's a fair few hours riding then, and it's just about making sure that we engage with people at regular spots and things like that, just to make sure that they get home safely afterwards, notwithstanding they're not actually able to do so under current restrictions.
Yeah, so interesting. You've mentioned education there. Neil mentioned it as well. What do you think, all of you, are the most effective interventions? Is it educating people about the problems? Is it stopping the crash in the first place? Is it mitigating the severity?
I'll jump in. I think I can still see I'm unmuted, so I'll just take this just quickly off. You're very limited, aren't you, in terms of what you can engineer out. So you're very reliant on people driving responsibly in rural areas. And I think it's useful when you can use things like Mosaic to identify who is coming into the area and having collisions, whether they're locals, and you can tailor that accordingly, or whether there's a different profile then. So whether people are coming from out of area and having collisions in there. But you are restricted, withstanding people miles and miles of rural road and very little traffic compared to urban densities. It doesn't tend to attract funding either.
Yeah.
Just make a quick point. I read up recently that the DVSA did a survey, and 20% of learner drivers had spent less than 2 hours learning about rural roads. 10% had spent no time at all on rural roads before their test. So you're looking at a cohort of people coming along who are already unprepared for their test, trying to pass as quickly and as cheaply as possible, who are doubly unprepared on rural roads. So I think, the intervention that's probably going to be the most successful is obviously going to be graduated driver licensing. And if we can get some form of GDL in, the RAC Foundation did a survey a couple of years back that showed that rural areas were the biggest beneficiaries from GDL, because they tended to have more younger people having these rural vehicle crashes. So I think the biggest intervention in terms of improving drivers' ability to cope with the roads is probably going to be GDL.
Sorry, John, I was just going to echo that. So I was going to say GDL as well. Given that rural research we did, there were 4 elements which really sit quite closely to GDL. So as I said, that rural young drivers get their licenses earlier, and we know that a minimum learning period would be beneficial. Nighttime restrictions, they were overrepresented in nighttime crashes. They were also overrepresented as having a higher number of young passenger casualties. So we don't know how many passengers they had, but they were more likely to have passengers injured. And they were also overrepresented as having positive breath tests. So those 4 elements of GDL that we would know are beneficial actually are all really very much represented amongst youngsters living in the countryside.
In terms of engineering, Susie, what do you think is the most effective solution? I mean, obviously you've been involved in the DFT Safer Roads programme, and what kind of interventions have been put in place by those authorities to try and reduce collisions and the severity of collisions?
Okay, so I think it's quite important to start off by recognising that we've got lots of different types of rural roads. So Highways England Strategic Road Network, there's so much vehicle flow on there that actually there are investable programmes that come up with, sensible economics and cost benefit analysis results. If you spend X, you save Y in terms of lives, and value of prevention is high. You then got the next tier of network below the strategic road network, the major roads network that's proposed for England. And the major roads network is the higher order local authority roads. And those roads, again, you can get really, really, really excellent investment packages for those types of roads with high benefit cost ratios. And so there's no brainer in terms of investing on them. You then get to the next layer of roads beneath the MRN, and you might be talking about local authority A roads that aren't quite as strategic as the ones that would be proposed for the major roads network. And those, again, you can get decent programs, and they're the ones that are probably the most similar to the Safer Roads Fund roads that from DFT's work a few years ago, where the 50 highest risk local A roads in England, and they could apply for funding to upgrade those. And typically on those, there were sort of low-cost countermeasures like raised revenge lines, for example, hugely beneficial in terms of casualty reduction, really quite cheap, and can even be included in your sort of maintenance kind of activities. So they don't need to be massive programs, but they can really make a difference in terms of casualty reduction. Things like centre cross-hatching in the centre of the road, just brings a bit more space between vehicles moving in opposing directions. Clearing hazards where you can. Sometimes that's a bit more challenging than it should be in terms of managing to get rid of crash risk at the side of the roads. Improving junctions, providing pedestrian crossing facilities, and so on. So all of those were measures that the Safer Roads Fund were in receipt of, and we estimate that overall as a package, I think you can end up for every £1 you invest, you get £4.40 back in terms of benefits to society as a whole. These are really investable roads. Now, you get below those local authority A roads, and things start getting a bit trickier in terms of getting the economic returns. There are still things you can do, but I think more and more at that point, you have to start leaning on speed management in order to achieve the serious casualty reduction that we're after, and heading towards safe system that we're after, and ultimately getting closer towards zero casualties on our networks.
That's brilliant. That's really leading into our next section, which we'll start in a second. I just want to acknowledge some of the questions that are happening. So we are recording all of the questions here. I'll make sure that all of the attendees have a copy of them, because there have been some that have been directed to people personally, asking for data and things like that. So I'll make sure that they get done. But maintenance has been mentioned as something that can be done. And I think we'd all agree that, you know, high quality maintenance on rural road networks can certainly help with, you know, road surfaces, visibility issues, things like that. So yeah, I think we will start to move on to the next section then, because I know that not all of us can stay for the entire time, and we should really try and wrap up not too long after 3 o'clock. So here's the next section, which is about speed. So I'm going to talk briefly about what a safe speed is in our rural roads. I've got some slides that have been provided by the attendees as well, and then we'll talk about how we achieve compliance. But first of all, I'm going to launch this poll. I'll allow the panelists to vote as well on this one. So the poll, which should have popped up on everybody's screens, is around what should the maximum national speed limit be on single carriageway rural roads, so unstreet lit, outside of a town, therefore. And I've talked about the maximum speed limit. I know there is a different speed limit for different vehicle types. So I'm just talking about what the maximum should be. So effectively, what should the speed limit be for cars? I'm sure you all know that it's 60 at the moment. So there's a number of options up there, and I'm going to let all 102 of you vote on this one, and then I'll show the results in a little while. So I'll let you carry on thinking about that, and I'll just go and show the next couple of slides, and I'll take the poll off in about 30 seconds. So talking about setting speed limits, I think this is the diagram that Susie was possibly referring to earlier, which is showing about different collision speeds. So this is a very famous chart, and it's something that Tanya and I have included on our safe system courses. So this is showing the fatality risk at different speeds. So, you know, if you're having a head-on collision and you've got your speed in excess of 60 miles per hour, then it's highly likely to result in a fatality. And then we've got the side collisions and the pedestrians and cyclists there. So side collisions, obviously that's really relevant on rural roads where you've got junctions. So wherever you've got junctions, then you're going to have the high risk of a fatality, and that really doesn't fit within a safe system or Vision Zero approach. So we are talking about speed limits and potentially what the speed limit should be. Here's a slide from France. So this is from Manuel Salathe, who attended our Joining the Dots conference just before lockdown. And this was what happened when France changed their speed limit. So many of you may be aware they changed it from 90 km/h to 80 km/h. And what this is showing is on their fixed speed sensors, the immediate drop in vehicle speed that happened just because they changed their speed limit. So, you know, an impressive change just in speed when you just change that national speed limit. And they have seen significant reductions in road casualties on the roads where they changed. So that's France. Neil did ask me to highlight this one here, which is showing that actually there is really good compliance with our speed limit at the moment. And I think it is important to recognise that there is really good speed compliance there, whereas you don't have that level of compliance within a 20. So there's a question there about what is the best speed limit. Is it one that achieves compliance, or is it one that displays an aim rather than achieves the outcome? So we'll talk about that now, I think. So I'm going to end the polling there, as just about everybody's managed to join in on that one, and I'll show the results in a few moments. So what is a safe speed on our rural roads? Would anybody like to consider that as a question? What's a safe speed, do you think? Anybody? Neil?
I think it varies. I think you can't have, and I think the point of that last slide was to show that if you just put a blanket change on, then you don't necessarily get the change in behavior that you want, or the driver behavior changes, the speeds that you need. I think if you're looking at a safe system, then there should be a variety of speed limits. I think we do have a very simplistic approach to speed limits in the UK. 60 is clearly nonsensical when you're driving off a main A road down a lane and the speed limit goes up because you've come off a controlled road onto an uncontrolled road. That is clearly silly. But ultimately, people take their speed cues from the environment, and I think of the road, and that's been shown in lots of different studies over the years. So if you simply change the limit and don't change the road, then the drivers aren't going to get the message. So it has to be part of a wider information kind of, why are you changing the speed limit here? What is the issue? I mean, I've been involved with Eurorap over many years, and 5-star roads and 1-star roads. And I think, it's been a fantastic program, Eurorap, but what it didn't manage to do was really communicate to the individual drivers. It certainly communicated to government. It communicated to the Safer Roads Fund. It's helped to target the investment on our worst roads. But I don't think if you stop the average driver and said, are you on a 2, 3 or 4-star road, they just don't get it. So we do need a bit more information there to back it up. But ultimately, I think if you've got a safe road system, then really you should be reviewing the speed limit. Happy for the speed limits to go up and down. They have done. There's been major speed limit reviews in England and also in Scotland over the years, and speed limits have gone up and some have gone down, some have stayed the same. But I just think it's the one thing we don't like, and this also came out of discussions I had with some colleagues in France. It was the blanket nature of the change in France that upset most people, rather than the fact there was a change. They were quite happy to have a change. If there was a requirement, a safety problem, and there was a speeding issue, that's no problem. But it was the blanket nature. So speed limits, I say it's the blanket nature, and you should be targeting the speed limit based on the analysis of the road through something like Eurorap.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody have any comments on how well we think the existing speed limit is understood by motorists?
I was just replying to a question online just to say that it's quite common feedback in our driver education courses, or speed awareness courses as they're popularly referred to, that people tend not to know what the national speed limit was, and that certainly is a module in that part of driver education. But in general, I will say that we tend to see better compliance on our rural roads, so that a higher percentage of the traffic will be complying and a smaller percentage will be exceeding the speed limit to a greater degree. So by and large, as your previous slide shows, the compliance doesn't tend to be so much of an issue. It's loss of control and the odd sort of road user choosing to exceed them.
Yeah, you supplied some images, didn't you, just before this, highlighting consistency as an issue. Do you want to say what you meant by these two?
Yeah, it's two rural roads in the same county in Wales, long, straight, plenty of fields either side. One's a 60 and one's a 50. What the county have been doing is rolling out a reduced speed limit of 50 miles an hour according to road safety risk. So this road, the 50 mile an hour road, has got higher collisions on it, so that was applied to it beforehand. It was a rolling measure of it was changed as part of rolling measures, so there's not a definitive effectiveness, but certainly that road there, the collisions have reduced in line with everything else. So it's just about, for the road user, really understanding exactly what it may be, especially you can see the sign on the right there, the national speed limit's already started to be overgrown. We get that quite consistently. There's not really much we can do about that. You know, it's when it's summer, bushes grow. So it's just about, if there is a message for the public, making it consistent to encourage compliance.
So consistency, but not always a blanket approach. But then that does mean the added complication of signage. So if you wanted to reduce the speed limit to 50, that means you've got to have lots of signs and repeater signs.
Unless you change it, yeah. But, and I think that as a result of coronavirus, the Deputy First Minister in charge of transport in Wales, where obviously we've got, well, the Welsh Government got devolved powers to set local speed limits. I think they've been asked to look at the national speed limit of 60 and consider reducing it to 50. And of course, this is probably more for urban areas, but we've already got the consultation on 20s as well. So we're looking at changing default national speed limit in Wales already.
Any of the other panelists got comments on speeds on mobile roads?
Yeah, so whilst I think in an ideal world, you would set speed limits according to what the safe speed would be to travel on that road, and have lots and lots and lots of different speed limits. The cost involved in signing those speed limits might be prohibitive. Also, if you just work on the basis of what's safe, my concern would be that that you might find yourself in a situation where the speed limits come down so low that then they become non-credible, non-self-explaining to the motorists. You end up with lots of people exceeding them, so then there's no real point, really. So for me, it's all about getting the balance of functional speed, the speed that the road has got to achieve to fulfill its role within the network. So that's to do with road function. Is it from town to town? Is it feeding into a main A road? What's it trying to achieve? Is it meant to be a cycle route? Those things are all going to have an impact on the road's function within a hierarchy. Get functional speed, and then try and get the safety of the actual infrastructure in line with what you need that road to function at. And then also you've got to try and get the credibility of that all lined up as well, so that people naturally want to travel at the speed that the road is posted at. That's really the framework to achieving safe systems, in my opinion. So functional, safe and credible speeds, all nicely in harmony, if you like. Actually doing that is more challenging than it might sound from an easy outline, a nice little sort of schema, but I think functional speed is important. You can't just lower all speeds and just expect people to adhere to them, because it's not going to happen. And equally, if you lowered the speed to what is currently safe, you might end up with lots and lots of very, very low speed limits and, you know, poor compliance.
Okay, right. So what I'll do now is I will share the results of the little poll there. So you should all be able to see these up on screen. I know some people had a problem where they couldn't vote. That sometimes if pop-ups are blocked and you're running Zoom through a browser, it means that the poll doesn't come up. I'm sorry about that. We do tend to get it on. A small percentage of people can't get involved because they haven't done that. But I think the overwhelming support, 59%, seems to support a reduction in the national speed limit to 50 miles per hour. I remember people voted on this before we all talked about what we thought the appropriate speed should be. Only 18% suggesting it should be the same. One person doesn't think there should be a speed limit at all, and 2 people think it should be something else. So I'm going to guess something that maybe ends with a 5, or just any other digit rather than one that ends in 0. Yes, 30s and 40s, not too many people in there, but you know, I think that's reasonably clear. Okay, very, very interesting. I wonder if anybody will do anything about it. There we go. Right, thank you for taking part, everybody in that section. Looking through some of the questions that we had come through, there's one there about from Matt about how if the symbol for de-restricted roads remains for 60 in England, how will the difference to 50 be known in Wales if the same sign is used? Teresa, do you know if the Welsh Assembly have thought about that one yet?
I wouldn't have thought so.
Okay, there we go. A quick answer, and I think brevity is perhaps good on this point as we get through to the next section then. So this one is about road users. So we've touched on road users in the opening section a little bit. And we talked about who's more at risk. So we talked about old drivers and young drivers. And there was a comment in here from Carol Hawley actually saying that older drivers are often confused by changing speed limits. You know, ones that regularly change along a stretch of road. And I don't think it's restricted to old drivers as well. I think it's restricted, it's a lot of drivers struggle with changes in speed limits. I'm just thinking about older drivers then. Has anybody got any particular comments on specific features of rural roads that they think may be more of an issue for rural older drivers?
So through our work with the Older Drivers Task Force, we know that there are some challenges with at-grade turnings, particularly turning right onto a higher speed road. I think we've had a particular example of that in the media in recent years. Right turns where you're turning onto a busier road is particularly challenging, which is another reason why speeds might need to be reduced when you've got the opportunity for side impacts, which can be particularly nasty.
Okay.
I think there are also general hygiene issues we've discussed. Things like signposting is going to be very important for older drivers going forward as more and more come along. But potentially we could be looking at different licensing arrangements. It does happen in certain countries around the world that you can have a limited license that allows you to go on your local roads only. So, if the car is the only option for people, and people should be planning ahead for giving up driving, and that's one thing that we're not very good at in the UK. But ultimately, there may be options around licensing that allow you to carry on using your car on certain roads just for that trip to the local doctor's surgery or the local shopping. And particularly now with the issues we're having with public transport, that could be even more important in the future, to have a bit more flexibility. So flexibility in things like speed limits, but also flexibility in things like driver licensing to cope with the different number of people and the different kinds of people who are using the roads, because everybody's using the roads in rural areas. I don't think anybody should be necessarily stopped from using the roads or restricted in some form. But if you do tidy them up, have nice clean signposting, no potholes, then everybody can use them.
Mm-hmm. I think everybody would like no potholes. Cyclists, everybody else. Anybody other comments on older drivers or other age groups that are using the roads? No, that's fine. Vehicle types. So Teresa's mentioned motorcycles. Now, as I attempted to show on my graphic, the number of motorcyclists killed or seriously injured is more or less the same on urban and rural roads. Is the rural road problem the tourists, the weekend bikers, or is it people using rural roads as cut-throughs? Any opinions on this?
Just from some work that we've done in the east of England looking at young motorcyclists, I was really quite struck by how many young riders, there was a peak in young riders in kind of September, October time from very deprived rural areas who were looking like they were riding on routes towards colleges, and that seemed to be echoed by the time of year. So I think it's not just about the fast leisure riders, but actually those, again, inexperienced, having to ride for a particular purpose in all conditions, perhaps with not the best equipment or training, and going long distances on roads that they're really quite unfamiliar with. We were really quite struck by that particular finding.
I think if you look at the speed compliance statistics as well, there is an issue with motorcycles are a bit higher in terms of their compliance, or a bit worse off, so that you've got car compliance is quite good, lorry compliance, but motorcycle compliance is less so on many of the different roads user types. So there's an issue about speed. If you look at speed as an issue in terms of crashes, fatal crashes involving motorcyclists, it's more prevalent amongst motorcyclists as well. Clearly, at IEM RoadSmart, we represent, if you like, the sort of responsible end of the market. And I've been working with a couple of organizations just this week on giving guidance to the more responsible people about how to go back about things like group ride outs and so on. But clearly, as we've seen from local coverage, the motorcyclists are desperate to get back out at the weekends, and you know, it is a difficult one to control. And if you've got that speed compliance problem, then you come back to enforcement. And how do you perhaps maybe target the enforcement at those minority of motorcyclists who are really pushing the speed limits, and allow the rest who are willing to abide by the rules to carry on motorcycling? Because ultimately, I think motorcycling does have a big role to play in rural transport going forward, particularly for low-income groups. As we come out of the recession that might be caused by coronavirus, motorcycling could be very important.
Yeah, I think effective enforcement of motorcycles is very difficult. It's something I had a little bit of experience of in Thames Valley, and I think a more covert approach is often required. I don't know whether Teresa wants to say anything on covert enforcement of motorcycles or not. I know Tanya's had experience as well.
We don't do covert enforcement. We've been restricted from doing that in the partnership. And in general, I think it's normally it's the more overt approach which has led to compliance. And in fact, Operation Darwin is our motorcycle enforcement campaign. We tend to find that it's cars really that exceed the speed limit. And of course, you know, it's simple law of kinetic energy. And if you're on a motorcycle, you're more vulnerable. And so in general, you know, general terms, if we make quite a big noise about being out in enforcement to get compliance, because we don't ever want to catch anybody. We just want that level of compliance to sort of, as I said, you know, come and enjoy the roads and get out safely as well. So we don't tend to find on our enforcement days that it's actually the motorcycles that are committing the offences.
But yes, going back a long while ago when I was involved in enforcement, there were particular routes in the partnership area I worked in which did have high motorcycle collisions and incredibly high speeds recorded. There was signage to say that covert enforcement was undertaken. There were rumours in the press about which types of vehicle we might be using for enforcement. Actually, we caught very few because compliance suddenly became very good, because people wondered whether or not that particular tractor at the side of the road might be being used for enforcement activities or not. So I think obviously it needs to be a mixture, and it was very, very targeted and publicised that we would be doing it. So to try and get the public on board.
I also think it needs to be more consistent. I mean, there's a lot of inconsistency about things like bike safe, about the amount of priority that different police forces give to any kind of speed enforcement, let alone motorcycle enforcement. And I'm also quite like the idea of the fact that speed awareness courses for cars aren't necessarily addressing the same issues that the motorcyclists who've been caught speeding might have fallen foul of. So a speed awareness course for motorcyclists would be quite good as well, delivered on a more consistent basis across the UK.
That's a good idea. Susie, I know you have to disappear any second now, but is there a 5-star road for motorcyclists? So what kind of things would you need in place?
A 5-star road for motorcyclists might be pushing it. I think in terms of our work with our sister charity IRAP over in countries where there is a greater proportion of motorcycles on the road, we end up with segregated motorcycle facilities, which really is the only option, but I can't really see that being practical here. Ultimately, if you're on a motorbike, you are vulnerable, and I think that's something that you know, we have to almost accept, I'm afraid, just because of the human body being frail. We can do things to improve roads so that your chances of being killed or seriously injured on a motorcycle are slightly reduced, but we can't go the whole hog. You know, we can put up guardrail, we can make sure that the road surface is free of changes in texture and so on, which are important for motorcycling, but ultimately, yeah, motorcycling is high risk. There's limited stuff that we can do on the road. Yeah.
Okay. We are.
That's
still
not a very. Go on. Sorry.
We are still a long way from having. I mean, I remember backing the IHI guidelines on motorcycle design, asking for a motorcycle design champion in every design office, and that was a long time ago. So we still don't have engineers who know how to design for motorcycles.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Susie. I know you're
a negative note to end on, I'm afraid, but yeah, sorry, I've got to go.
That's okay. Thank you for joining.
Pleasure.
I think we'll just have a quick conversation on locals versus outsiders, as it's been mentioned already. And I wonder if this would align a little bit with some of Neil's comments earlier about the fact that some people just don't get any training on rural roads. I mean, is there a way of identifying whether locals are safer per mile driven, or whether the risk is higher to outsiders who aren't used to the roads?
Going back to that rural young driver research that we did, they were most likely to be involved in crashes on rural roads. So one of the conclusions we came to back in 2013 when we did this was it seemed very nonsensical that these 17-year-olds who are going to be driving predominantly on rural roads are spending an hour in the nearest town taking their test on roads that actually they will rarely drive on, that they're not well equipped for it. So actually from that piece of research, it did look like it was locals, that they were driving locally to where they live, but they were particularly inexperienced in handling those conditions.
Yeah. I've seen some analysis on roads like the A9, which has this reputation for being a tourist hotspot, but in actual fact, a lot of the people there had come from fairly local postcodes and then had a crash. So it's not necessarily always, you might get the big high-profile crashes involving foreign tourists and so on, but I think the ultimate problem, and we're seeing this in areas like the North Coast 500 at the top end of the country. How would you deliver that? How would you identify somebody who's arriving in the north of Scotland, is renting a camper van, has never seen a passing place before in their life? How would you deliver something to them other than an education campaign? So lots of education campaigns, lots of leaflets, lots of signposting, but actually delivering some training to that kind of person. And we've actually been discussing that with the North Coast 500 people, how we could do that, and our local groups in Inverness tried to get involved, but it's very difficult to find a mechanism for delivering that to people who are just traveling through.
Okay, right, we'll move on to our final section then. There's a few more comments that I'm going to try and address in this one. This one is around COVID-19. And what impact has it had on rural road use? So I've brought up these topics: speeds, cyclists, pedestrians, the change in the types of people using the roads. I must apologise for not mentioning horse riders on rural roads. I should have done that. They are the forgotten VRU. I'm proud to include those within the site selection criteria work that we did for Transport Scotland, because I think it is always important to include them, even if the numbers may be very small. But maybe we can talk a little bit about horse riders when we come on to this next section. So in terms of COVID-19 effects and speeds, I've got a little bit of data here. So we have been carrying out an analysis of speed surveys throughout March and April and looking at the changes. So it's over 100 different speed surveys on different roads. So it's a speed survey every day on hundreds of different roads in different speed limits. We've got some 20s, we've got some 40s and 50s and some 70s as well. What I wanted to do here is highlight some of the key findings that we have, and we're hoping that this paper will be published by the end of the week. So what it did show is that when you have a change in flow on existing roads of 1,000 vehicles, so imagine this is all of our 30 roads joined together, so it's the average flow, then it will increase by average speeds by 1.27 miles per hour. But on 60 limit roads, we've seen the increase much higher, and not only in terms of numbers, but relative to the speed limit, of course. So that's increased by 4.24 miles per hour. This does stand out compared to the other road types. So what we've seen during lockdown is that the reduction in flow is seeing a much higher increase in the average speeds. But then perhaps even more concerning are the two figures at the bottom. So where we've looked at the proportion of vehicles that are traveling at more than 15 miles an hour over the speed limit. Now, I know that 15 miles an hour above the speed limit in a 30 is 45, and that's higher as a percentage above the limit. But, you know, 15 miles an hour is still 15 miles an hour. It's still the same distance on the speedo. And if you think about what levels of compliance look like in different speed limits, I think it does make it much more comparable rather than looking at a percentage change in the speeds. So we've seen that, you know, the high-end speeders have only increased by 12.1% when you have this change in 1,000 vehicles. But on 60 mile per hour roads, that's enormous. So 725% there. And actually, if you look at the confidence intervals, you can see that we've got enough data within this to make us pretty certain that this is a reliable and robust finding, that, you know, rural roads are where we're seeing a high level of speeding. Although, of course, going back to the previous graphic, compliance was really good there before. So you might have compliance that is still better than it is on 30s, but that's where we've seen this big change. I don't know if any of the panelists have any comments on those findings that I've just shared this moment.
I think it is one of the really interesting things of this whole coronavirus, that excessive speeding has really come under focus. But I think you have to go back to the compliance figures to a certain extent, and also other research from the past. It is a very small minority of the overall driving population who speed excessively, well over the speed limit. Now, clearly, speeds have gone up, and that's just probably a function of the fact the roads are quieter, less turning traffic, all that kind of thing. But I think it's what it has done. It's certainly done it for urban areas with people like Superintendent Andy Cox in the Met area, is it's focused police enforcement activity onto excessive speeding. So they're actually getting out there, they're catching people, they're using intelligence. What I'm not sure about is if that's happening in rural police forces. It's certainly happening in urban police forces, motorways, so on. But I think it would be great to think that the focus on excessive speeding would lead to more enforcement of the same targeted nature that we're seeing in other areas, in rural areas. But I don't seem to see the same coverage of that. It could just be because I'm not following the right Twitter feeds, but you know, I think that's what we need. This sort of activity is only going to be stopped by high-profile policing targeting that minority who are willing to do that, and that seems to be happening in some police force areas. It needs to happen in rural areas as well.
Yeah, I think it's hard to comment on particular police force areas. Just on my experience, there does seem to be a lot more high speed, and the types of people driving at high speed, they seem to be not the people that normally use the rural roads. There's a lot of younger drivers driving more souped up modded cars, things like that. I've been very surprised at the types of vehicles that I've seen. Maybe they're all on furlough and they're bored and they're driving around. I mean, it's not evidence-based, it's just my own personal hypothesis. I mean, Teresa, are you able to comment on any enforcement within Wales?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, just to echo what Neil said, it's definitely intelligence-led, and a large part of the COVID-19 response has been led by roads policing units all across Wales. What they're seeing is the vehicles that they're stopping very often have other offences. When we read our daily states and our sort of operation updates, that there's other offences as well. So, but I think in terms of enforcement and speed limit compliance, the fact that generally speaking we are seeing people speeding a little bit more, it goes back to, I suppose, to the safe systems approach. And the roads haven't changed, but driver behaviour certainly has. Possibly there was a perception that enforcement, particularly by the safety camera partnerships, perhaps wasn't as prevalent as it normally is. And there was a perception that people could travel as fast as they wanted on the roads, which hopefully we're going to be putting to bed. There's quite a lot. We are updating our blog almost weekly. Our comms marketing manager is doing that. But certainly I think driver behaviour did change a little bit. I'm hoping that the results that have happened throughout COVID-19 and the roads policing response, how effective that's been in managing it, just serves to complement, you know, I mean, the packed paper on roads policing was out last week, but certainly the other offences they're uncovering as well as speeding. And there's a lot of behavioural research out there as people who choose to break the law excessively, chances are there's something else of interest to the police as well.
Tanya, have you got any comments on the psychology aspect?
Well, I think as Teresa's just said there, that there is a lot of work that's being done about those who are more likely to break the COVID-19 rules full stop are of a type, and certainly there's been research previously that those who engage in speeding behaviour are more likely to have other criminal histories as well, high-end speeding, you know, that there are links there. So yeah, I think that is well evidenced. I think the other thing that is concerning or yeah, about the increase in speeding is the fact that people are definitely using rural roads for cycling and for walking more frequently than previously. And I've, yeah, again anecdotal, but I've seen very young children on really busy rural roads who are riding, you know, fully kitted up, and they've obviously seemed confident enough to be riding. You would hope that their presence would be slowing people down. It's just whether or not that's actually trickling through, and people are driving to anticipate the increase in cyclists and pedestrians that they're now encountering. And I don't have any evidence either way on that one, I'm afraid.
Yes, I think some sentiment on the chat that you know, the fact that we've got more cyclists, pedestrians, and potentially horse riders as well on the roads, and now traffic levels are starting to return to normal. What's going to happen here? I'm not sure that we have the answer, that we know what's going to happen. Were the people that were using the roads doing it for long enough to now accept that they're much more likely to come across a vulnerable road user? Or will we now have this really dangerous moment of conflict where you've still got lots of people cycling, walking, riding, but then we've got cars coming back and they're traveling at high speeds?
I think there is a dangerous few months ahead, particularly depending on what happens with public transport in rural areas as well. If it is really decimated, then the pressure is going to be back on people to get back into cars. They might be getting into older vehicles. Perhaps some of these vehicles are being driven untaxed and MOT'd, uninsured, because they weren't driving them before. More people on motorbikes as well. And I think there's a risk that cyclists and pedestrians could be edged out, because the roads themselves aren't going to change. We're not going to have this spending that we've seen in urban areas on segregated facilities. So you're going to have a dangerous few months. And I think that's something that I'm quite worried about. And I also read recently that estate agents are seeing an upturn in inquiries from people who want to move out into rural areas. So even more so, you're going to have this move out of the cities. Perhaps people don't want to be in the cities anymore because of air quality issues, because of the coronavirus fears. That may lead to more working from home, which is fine, but it certainly would probably lead to more long distance driving as well. It may go either way, we just don't know. If we get that number of cyclists out there, there's this safety in numbers argument. I just worry that safety in numbers argument doesn't quite work so well on an unsegregated, narrow 60 mile an hour rural road as it does in the centre of London, where there's facilities for it. So yeah, I do think I have some concerns that the next few months could be difficult.
Yeah, I think the majority of the cycling that's been happening recently is leisure cycling, which is very different and tends to take part at different times of the week or even day. If we're going to be having cyclists using our rural roads, or certainly the ones that are closer to towns, in rush hour periods, then you would expect that to propose a much higher risk if we're not going to be having a significant change in speed limits or a change in infrastructure. One thing that was mentioned last week on the webinar was around changing urban environments, putting in temporary lanes. Do any of you see temporary cycle and walking lanes popping up on some of our rural roads?
I would like to think so. My further concern about the economy going forward is that having taken part in a couple of Highways England meetings over the last few years, the investment in new major roads nearly always brought with it improvements to vulnerable road user facilities as well. So if we start to see major cuts in what was a fantastic programme in England of improvements, road improvements, some people may argue for and against that, but it did seem to me that by investing in new roads, at the same time we could deliver modern segregated facilities. And if we do see cutbacks in the Highways England programme, which might happen because of the state of the economy, then we end up losing out, because we don't have safer roads built to Eurorap standards, but we also don't have them delivering facilities for vulnerable people alongside them.
Teresa?
I think in Wales there's a definite appetite to sort of capture the moment, really, with people improving their active travel, the cyclists and pedestrians in rural areas or whatever. And the Welsh Government is, I think, offering some funding bids for the highways authorities in Wales to capitalise on that. What it eventually looks like, I don't know. But they're committed to active travel and improving active and sustainable travel for the future. And I think that, as I said earlier, we can't create any more road space. So I think segregated travel is possibly of more concern in the rural areas. But, it's possible. In Carmarthenshire, where I live, the Welsh Government have purchased some sort of segregated routes to upgrade for cyclists. It's not perfect, it's not ideal for everybody. I'm a leisure cyclist myself. During the start of COVID-19, with fewer vehicles on the road, I definitely saw more considerate road user behaviour for myself on my cycle, in terms of plenty of space to overtake, and that could be accountable for motorists having fewer other vehicles to contend with on the road. So possibly weren't in so much of a rush, but there was a definite uplift. And as we're seeing more vehicles on the road now, it's just about watching the space and how we then go forward in terms of managing sort of many users on the road. I know Alan's watching on the call, but the horse riders as well. And it's about, I suppose, sharing the space and it being complementary for everybody. But there's very much an appetite in Wales for moving, having a modal shift in terms of moving away from the fact that car is king here at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I think we're going to see a very different set of collision statistics for 2020 compared to previous years. There's no doubt that we're going to have a drop in the number of recorded killed and seriously injured casualties. I strongly suspect it will be by far the lowest ever recorded. There was a question about whether the change in speeds will have seen a change in the number of KSIs. And well, obviously it's not going to show an increase, even though the speeds have increased. The number of road users is more than halved. So yes, you wouldn't expect to see that. Now, I am aware of some authorities that are starting to look at some early data, and I know that it's happened in France and it's happened in the Netherlands as well, where they've got really up-to-date collision analysis data, which we don't always have in the UK, and certainly not across the whole of the country. They're showing that yes, there have been big reductions due to lockdown, but certainly in terms of killed and seriously injured, it hasn't dropped by as much. Which could be for many different reasons. We could all pin it on speed and say, well, it's definitely because of these speeds. It could be because we've got more VRUs using the road network, and that's likely to result in much higher injury severities as well. I think we'll only know when we get the first data through. It'd be really good if information from the crash system that the DFT has access to could be shared and made available to those of us who are interested in carrying out this kind of research. Okay, we have just about gone past our time now then. Just wanted to open it to any of the panelists remaining, if they've got any last comments they wanted to make on the rural roads.
I just want to make one last point, which is last summer we did get a promise of a rural road user forum from the Department of Transport in their update of their road safety strategy. I'm not sure if that's just been lost with coronavirus, but I think that there was definitely a focus on rural road users in that document. It's now up to the DFT to start delivering on that. And certainly I think if there was some kind of user group feeding in all this kind of thing into the Department of Transport, that would be very helpful for everybody involved. So I would look forward to hearing more about the rural road user forum. Difficult to say, and obviously difficult to set up by the sound of it as well.
Yeah. Excellent point, Neil. Yes, it is one of the DFT's priorities, rural roads. Whether it's rural roads or rural road users, I think it's possibly a combination of the both. Any further comments from either Teresa or Tanya?
I just think, going back to my initial point, that actually thinking about the use of rural roads from a community point of view and transport within a planning structure. So, you know, with shops closing, with colleges being located in urban areas, public transport not always being available, how can we be inventive to allow people to still be mobile, but ensure that those at risk are, you know, protected and offered alternatives? So I think it's not thinking about road safety and transport on its own would be really quite important.
Okay, right. Thank you all for taking part. A special thanks to the panelists there today. Thank you to everybody that's been joining in and asking lots of questions. We haven't had time to get through a lot of them. I've tried to weave them into the conversations wherever I can do. Zoom does handily save a copy of all of the questions so that we can have a look at them later on. If there's anything specific that you did want to mention, you can certainly get in touch with all of us. I know that you know, our contact details are reasonably easy to find for me and Tanya. Feel free to write to me if you do have any questions that you would specifically like any of our panelists to answer, and I'll make sure that those are forwarded on. Okay, so with that, thanks again, everybody. Just a reminder, please do go to the Agilysys website and have a look at the Standing Together link at the top for details of more webinars that we have coming later this month. We do have a whole series on older drivers that will pick up on a lot of the points that were mentioned here today. Okay, well, thank you all for attending, and do stay safe. Thank you very much.